Hello Team NDA, thanks for joining us for another episode and for supporting us every week. We read all of your messages, absolutely love the discussion online, so keep venting please. Make sure you follow us in all the usual places. We're at the NDA podcast. Leave a review and a rating wherever you're listening. We're really excited about this week's episode and frankly a bit concerned an hour isn't going to be long enough to cover everything that we want to. So we're talking about originality, specifically what it's like to have work copied or be accused of copying work. I think it's something that every creative can relate to in some form at some point in their career. I've got some lovely guests here who are going to share their experiences on both sides of the fence. Then I'm going to grill them about the issue at large. We're going to try and decipher why it's so commonplace in the industry. And the kind of broader question today, and maybe a little bit unrealistic for us to answer, is how easy is it to be original? So I'll let them introduce themselves. Tyler, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Tyler Hendy. I work at New Commercial Arts as a design lead, part of the CX team, and recently did a rebrand for Nationwide, a built-in society in the UK, which got a little bit of press. And some interesting stories maybe off the back of that about colours and logo shapes.
Nice.
Maybe over to Malika.
And hi, I'm Malika Favre. So I'm French, obviously, with the accent. I'm an illustrator, and I guess I'm coming from another perspective, which is going to make it interesting, is that my work has been copied a lot and over the years, and it's something that's very, very important topic. And one that's not talked about enough, I think. And I think there is a lot we can, find out and solution for illustrators. And really interested in the broader conversation.
Awesome. By now, you probably know who I am, but I'm Katie Cadwell, creative director at Lucky Dip, and your host today. My pronouns are she, her, and today's episode is going to be cracking. So let's just get on with it. We're going to kick off with some statistics. We borrowed Malika's Instagram following to send out some polls. And the first question was, have you ever copied work or had work copied? So 17% of people said neither, lucky bunch. 9% said they'd been blatantly copied. 34% said they had copied. And 40% said that they'd done both. So clearly this is something that impacts us all on some level, and realistically it's not nice either way. So I thought we'd start with what it's like to have work copied. So Malika, I guess you're really well placed to talk about that. So I want to talk about how it feels to have your work copied, maybe the first time, how it feels now, and how it's impacted you.
Well, so for me, I think so. I started my illustration career about 15 years ago, something like this. And I was very lucky that it kicked off like really strong, really fast. I think I arrived in a way at the right time, in the right industry. I was living in London and I was doing the right kind of work in a way to get commercial commissions. And then my work started to be a little bit everywhere really fast. And I think I probably enjoyed not being copied for a year, something like this. And then it started coming out, And I remember that back then everyone was telling me, like, I got really, really, really angry. Like I was really angry. I was a starting illustrator and I was like, you've given me 1 year, basically. I felt like someone was, stealing what I had worked so hard for. And everyone was telling me like, but really you should feel flattered. That was the thing, like just move on and feel flattered. And I was like, no, I really don't feel flattered. Like, I can't fake a feeling I'm actually not feeling. And I thought, okay, I need to, I can't get on like that because it's going to take a lot of energy from me, but also I can't sit back and do nothing because if I do that, I'm going to get completely vaporized by this industry and basically my career is going to be over in, 6 months. And I think the first time, there are a few times where I let it slide because I didn't know where to start. And I think the first case that really did it for me was like the big TV channel in the UK that took my work and did opening credits with it. Like just took my work. It wasn't even a copy. It was like taking my illustrations, doing opening credits, and putting it online. And back then I started looking into. I contacted a lawyer, and I said, like, how much would it be to send a letter to at least talk to these people? And he gave me an absolutely outrageous price, which I think back then was like 1K for a letter. And I thought like, wow, this is a lot, and especially for an independent illustrator. So it's like, not only are you being ripped off, but you have to pay to defend your work. And I remember that lawyer told me, like, I can write one letter, but probably they're going to do nothing. Like, probably they're going to say nothing. And I said, okay, let's do it. And we did it. And actually, I think I got an answer in the next half an hour from the TV channel. And in the matter of 4 hours, we had agreed on a settlement fee and for them to remove, which for me was the most important, remove the work in the next 24 hours for it to disappear. And I never worked with that lawyer again because I realized later it was an outrageous price, and he was seeing it short term. But I did realize there is, actually there is value in defending your work. And if people know and see that they are in the wrong, you can actually sue them and you can actually, you have a case. And most often they don't want this kind of information to go out. So that's when I realized from now on, when it's a big brand or a big agency, a big client, I'm not talking about a small illustrator ripping you off or some student getting inspired. I'm going to fight it. And so I surrounded myself with a team of lawyers. I have one in Paris and one in the UK. And I started fighting every single case.
Wow. And do you still get just as angry now?
No.
Because obviously, has it changed? And does it change how it impacts you now?
So I think the first time I actually not only got paid for what they had done to me, but also got the work removed, which for me was the magic formula. I realized, no, actually, I'm not going to be angry, and I'm not going to win every single one of them. But at least I feel there is some sort of justice. And I think in my head, what I decided very early on, which I really advise for young illustrators to do if they can. I know it's not easy to spend your own money on this, but that's something I decided very early on, is that any settlement, any money I would get from these cases, I was going to put on a different bank account. And as a joke, I called it my legal fund. So basically, next time there was a case, I was spending the previous guy's money to find the next one. And so in a way, it wasn't my money. And I thought it was kind of a really virtuous way to keep going, and also having the feeling that at the end of the day, all it was costing me was a bit of energy, time, because I always email the client or the people out of courtesy. But the second email is straight to my lawyer. And the fact that I could kind of push it aside and delegate that part meant that my emotional energy, like I was not wasting it on this. I was talking to my lawyer. We were laughing about it even. Of course, I got angry, sometimes, and I didn't win every single battle. But I don't know. I felt like, and also when it did happen, it did end well. I thought, well, maybe they'll think twice next time they want to rip another illustrator off. So in a way, I was it almost made me happy in some cases. Yeah,
it's really interesting. And I think that that emotional part of being either end of this experience is something that we really, really don't talk about. We also don't talk about the practical part of that, which we're going to come on to later. So I want to talk about being accused of copying. I've got an anonymous story that I'm going to read out. Hattie has edited this slightly because it was worded in a very, very strong way. We've just taken out some of the swear words. So I was accused by another designer friend of ripping off one of his company's pieces of work. It was on the day that the identity we'd created had launched. The client messaged me direct and forwarded an email from said designer. The email suggested that we'd ripped off a piece of their work and they weren't going to seek legal advice, but their client should. A weird move, as I knew the designer knew I'd done the work. Why not confront me directly about it? I called the client and said, I know this person well, so I'm going to call them and smooth it over. Jumped on the phone immediately, expecting to kind of smooth things over. The work was in a completely different sector. The only similarities were the use of the word with and a similar-ish blue. To my surprise, when I spoke to my friend, he called me a lazy designer and seemed convinced that I must have looked at his work before commencing my own. The project in question was already 5 or more years old and wasn't in my head at all. Cut a long story short, however much I pleaded innocence, he didn't believe me. We agreed to disagree, and that was that. I came off the phone deflated and more than a little gutted that someone I thought was a friend believed I'd ripped them off, and I lost my mojo for a few months. So quite sad, really. I wanted to jump to you, Tyler, because you've had a really similar experience with this recently with one of your projects. So I want to talk about your experience in that. Why do you think that people were so quick to kind of comment and call it out? And what was the kind of reaction? And ultimately, you know, how do you feel about it?
For me, the funniest thing was, I think, listening to some of your early episodes about reading the comments online as well. Mm-hmm. And I call myself like a small designer from Bendigo, a town in Australia that not many people have heard of, and I like moved to London and want people to see my work. I'm like, I can't wait for people to like actually talk about my work instead of like going onto Reddit and trying to post it there so it gets picked up by someone, or like paying to go on like Mind Sparkle Mag so anyone will look at it, to then like I'm like, just please look at my work and talk about it, to then finally doing a project big enough where people can't stop talking about it, and then having to like deal with bigger organizations understanding what the actual impact is, how many people are actually going to look at it, and then the comments that come on LinkedIn versus the DMs that come on LinkedIn. So I think one of the most interesting parts for me was like people trying to call it the nationwide color palette, for example. People were like, is it like, are they trying to do Monzo, or are they, because it kind of looks like NatWest? And it's like everyone was going one way or another way, and then people wanted to comment on it. And for me, I had kind of had to step back a little bit from all of that and be like, I can't believe they're talking about the work anyway. Like, great, this is such a huge career win for me.
I think like any press is good press.
Yeah,
which is true.
And so that was quite intense. So I think the other part of that was like the DMs that were coming in as well were also just full of like joy and like happiness for me. I'm like, yeah, we did do a good job. So I think that there was elements as well where you really want to talk about like how we got to where we got to. Like it was such an intense process and quite like condensed as well of you have to look at the market, you have to understand the market, who owns what colors, can you own a color, what can we do with our colors, like what is the digital accessibility, how can we be inclusive with our color contrast. And then that was actually one of the huge barriers and huge thoughts I had about originality in general, of like most of the time now with rebrands, the first thing people will do is like check if the color contrast ratio is good enough for accessibility. And by doing that, there's this huge limitation on what colors brands will use now and in the future. So I think already then we're getting squeezed into a certain palette to use. And it's like, well, we found the solution, and you can look at it in different lights, and you're like, oh, it kind of feels like a similar red. I'm like, yeah, annoyingly, lots of brands have similar reds. But there's other things that we've done in the palette that are true to the story of the story that we created, you know. So I was like, that was a win for me.
Yeah. I think that's awesome, because I think a lot of creatives, you know, we're not known to be the hardiest of people. We're a sensitive bunch. Would find that really hard. And there was, you know, I even saw there was like a lot of rhetoric about it online. So it's nice that you felt really kind of positive off the back of it. But how do you feel about people kind of seeing such a small section of the project? Because obviously these projects can go on for months and months. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes, and then it's reduced down to a before and after of a logo, essentially, or a logo up next to whatever the closest looking competitor is.
Yeah, that was another interesting thing of that one, being able to find one screenshot that works to a narrative of it looking like something else. And when we talk about like the holistic brand, and people were calling this out as well, and I was like, the holistic brand of, you know, what's one of the things you see most? It's the credit card or, you know, the debit card. And when you compare that against the competitors, you're like, oh, that is its own thing. It's like fully its own thing, but it doesn't work maybe for like the rest of the rhetoric that was happening online at that time. I was like, I can't wait for more people to see more of the project because they've only got one screenshot at the moment. And then you saw in the coming weeks, there's people like comparing the broader parts of what makes the brand, and be like, yeah, wow, that's its own thing. And it's such a move on for that company in general as well, that for me, that was so impressive of like the style that we created was such a move on for the brand itself that it felt unfair to compare it at that point to like the competitors when you do the full beyond one screenshot what this brand looks like.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also about context, isn't it? It's like when you take something out of context, in the case of, for me, in the case of an illustration, a cover is a cover. It's a cover. There is a broader context. But when you talk about a design identity, the context is so broad. So I think you're right that if someone looks at, if you find the right image in the right setting and you compare it to another image, and then you're like, look, it's exactly the same. But actually, you've chosen exactly the image that's supposed to look like it. And so I think in a way, it's harder for me, from my perspective, it's much harder for designers, you know, because I used to read creative review, I used to read, you know, all the logo reveal, and like the design mob is really hard, like really hardcore. They come for you. Like there is no illustration mob. No one comes for you. Like people are so lovely, and I live with the elves. I think like you're with the tough people.
Yeah, that's funny you say that. Again, it's like the byproduct of reading too many comments, of being like, oh, I've seen that name pop up again. Damn, he's talking about my, and doesn't like it again. That one name keeps popping up.
Yeah.
But no, I think that ultimately it's searching for originality in color as well, I think is like so tricky when you're working with big brands, with heritage, I just think color in general, everyone has such a knee-jerk reaction to like, I don't like purple. You know, oh, okay.
Yeah, of course.
What?
Right, of course, and also colors is linked. Colors as a symbol, as a like the meaning of color is entirely linked to the culture and the country you live in. So when you do a logo in the UK, you're going to have a completely different approach than if you do an identity for the same kind of brand in India, because it's going to have a totally different symbolism. So you can't escape. It's like, I think in French, like purple is the color of death. Clearly, no one is going to do a purple identity. Yeah. But in the UK, it has a completely different meaning. So yeah, I guess you're limited because you need that instant connection that people have to color.
But it's also, I feel like there's also that instant connection again when it's like, it's the cultural relevance as well as then like another recent rebrand that happened 12 months ago and you're halfway through yours and you're like, oh, well, now it looks like we might have copied it, but you know, we're halfway through the project or whatever that happens to be.
That's a really good point. There's nothing worse than seeing a typeface you're really excited to use come out 3 months before and you're like, fuck's sake. I want to unpack a little bit why we think this is happening more and more and why creating original work just feels harder than ever. And I think a large part of that problem is maybe stemming from the creative process. So the internet, social media, we now have unlimited reference. Literally, you can just keep scrolling. It never finishes. So we sent out another poll asking about reference and how many people use reference to start a project. So 71% of people said they use reference as a starting point but move away from it. I'm surprised at how high that is. 26% use reference and are heavily influenced by it. So we appreciate your honesty. Thanks for that. And 3% don't use reference at all. So they're like the creative gods, right? They're the geniuses amongst us. So I guess, what do you both think about online reference and how that's impacting originality?
Well, for me, like as an illustrator, I work a lot with references, but never with illustration as references. Like for me, my of course I do a lot of research. It's mainly research about, proportions, light, looking at the world is a way of doing, it's doing research. Taking a photo is doing research, but I do a lot on Google as well. But like, I think, in a way, I think it's probably what people said, 70%, you start with references, you gather all these, it's like almost like creating like a collage in your head. But then where it becomes ripping off is when you take a particular image and reproduce it, because that image already exists. So you shouldn't.
Yeah.
I know for me, my solution, my magic wand for that is that when I'm looking for like a very specific thing, which sometimes I am, because no one can draw everything. So sometimes I'm like, oh, I would love to draw a cat coming out of a gutter or whatever. Like, what does a gutter look like again? Like, sometimes you forget if you don't draw something all the time. So I start doing a lot of research. But what I try is to find the most easy, horrible picture of it. So it could be like image bank, really bad, but that has the structural element that I need, but nothing of the fancy. So I will never use a good photo as a reference. It always has to be really bad, like a bad photo. And I think for me, it's really, it kind of really helped me to, to stay away. But when I started, before I really found my voice, of course, I experimented with, trying to draw in different styles and, and I did a little bit of copying as well. I think the only thing is that I was so lucky that Instagram didn't exist back then and there was no social media. So all this work has gone into the abyss of, my past, and I'm very glad. But I think the problem, for me, the biggest problem today is that illustrators and young illustrators, I think it's normal to take inspiration and to like something in someone else's work and to experiment with it. The issue is that if you start posting it and sharing it with the world and these get more likes than your actual work, which is pretty shit, then you're going to want to basically to do it again. And so you're kind of putting yourself in that place where you're locking yourself down in that place where you end up being forced to rip someone off because you're getting more visibility that way. This is a very, very slippery slope. So my advice would be for illustrators never to reference illustration. Look at photographs, look at movies, look at other types of images.
Yeah. What about you, Tyler? Because there's more Nike ref than you can shake a stick at in our world, and the studios are full of it. So do you use it? How do you feel about it?
I think that I have to start by saying I've never heard of using a really terrible reference so that it can't be like, it's the idea of it, less the aesthetic of it. I think I have to steal that. Sorry. That's going to be part of my process.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I spend my life screenshotting a Getty image.
Terrible really images only is so good. Great. I mean, one thing I've realized, I think going through uni, you could tell a little bit like who's found the Behance reference and like use that. And I'm like, wow, you're so good. I remember looking at my work and being like, I'm so terrible. But there was a bit of a visual shortcut there of like what defined good style. And with that, then I was like, the way in which I'm like creating good work that I think is good is the story at the center of all of it. So there was like a freelance client that I had recently they called themselves Motel, where the E was a 3. It was about Web3 stuff. And I was like, I think the color palette should be like really beautiful motel signs that you find in like the US. And went and found these ridiculous old, huge metal signage pieces and was like, here's your color palette. And it might not be an original palette. I haven't seen much like it, but there's something about like that story so unique to that client that it is theirs. Mm-hmm. I think we did a similar thing with Nationwide as well. It was like what makes up the sense of community in the UK as like a society. So we found like, okay, what feels like a bakery, or what feels like a green park, or what feels like, we found like a way of getting the tourism, like, the brown tourism signs when you go to a UK town, like that brown became part of that palette. And I'm like, because that's true to them. So I think I'm kind of focusing on color a little bit there, but overall the idea of like, what's the unique story that you can build from, then it has to be original to that client, even though you might pick it from nature or you might pick it from other parts of society. Yeah.
Super interesting, because I think it's all too easy to search for hashtags and scroll Arena and scroll Pinterest So I feel like people will maybe take a little bit from that about broadening their reference pool. I just want to read out another story from Rita, who is a creative director, and they said they've worked with lots of different fashion brands throughout their career, and in the most recent role there was no actual creative process, and instead the team were briefed using references from big fashion houses and literally told to recreate them. So the client plays a massive role in this, whether they're coming to you, like I'm sure you have experiences, Malika, where they come to you and ask for something you've already done, or they come to you with a piece of ref from another agency, another project, and they say, this is what we want. So how do we manage clients that want something that they've already seen?
For me, like, that's the biggest conversation as an illustrator to have about copies. I actually don't blame clients. I blame creative directors. I blame the ad agencies every single time, because they are the ones that are responsible. They are the ones that are selling creativity to the client. The client is like a child with a giant ego and a big bank account. And they are going to be capricious. And they are going to be like, I want this, and I want it green, and I want it now. But you don't tell a plumber how to do their job. And for me, it's exactly the same. So if the agency, the creative director caves in, we've lost the battle, but it's not the child's fault. And I think in my case, that's why I've had a lot of cases against advertising agencies, because the problem is, like, they were being lazy, basically. Like when I was like 20, the role of a creative director, first of all, a creative director and an AD could not draw like well, but could put a sketch together and show his ideas with a pencil. Whether you do that with a pencil or with a collage or Photoshop, or tomorrow you do it with AI, you could show a concept to the client. And the idea is like, here is the idea, and then on the side of the idea, here are 5 mood boards of where we could go with it visually. In the past 15 years, that got completely lost. The AD became someone with passing plates and doesn't do anything creative. And I ended up in a lot of situations where the creative agency had shown only my work to the client. So it's great to do a mood board with my work, but I know my work, I've done it, and I haven't said yes to the project. So basically what happened a lot of time is that they were selling my work to the client said yes, without knowing how expensive I was. And then they were contacting me, and I was saying no for whatever reason, whether it was budget or I didn't want to work for that brand or I was too busy. And then they ended up like, oh my God, we've sold this to the client. We got the budget signed off. We've got a big margin in, because in the end we spent 3 hours on it. And what do we do now? Well, we're going to go to the next best thing, which is they're going to try and hire another illustrator with either free or younger or cheaper. And at the end of the day, that other illustrator is also a victim in this, because sometimes they don't have the balls to say no, or they need the money, or they didn't think about the repercussions of it. And so for me, it was like it started happening more and more and more. And the stupid thing is that in many of the cases, I actually had the original email saying, we want you to work in this campaign. So I was like, proof is here. Like, you can't deny that, And so for me, and then when you actually confront agencies about it, it's always, in my experience, it's exactly the same scenario, which is actually hilarious. It became a joke. It's like, it's always the same. They always get back to you, obviously, because they know they're in the wrong, and threatening to contact the client directly is a very effective way. And basically, like, every single time it's the same thing. They say, oh, that person is on maternity leave, or that was done by an intern, or that person no longer works with us. Really, it's every single. And so when I've heard it like 10, 50 times, I was like, wow. Yeah. Like, so I think it's for me, this is where it really became a problem. And that's why we saw so many more rip-offs of illustrators and image makers out there. It's because the creative directors and the agencies stopped taking risks and confronting their clients and challenging their clients and telling their clients, look, we can't do this because that person is not, available, but we could go that way, which also enters your brief and also is going to look amazing, and that person is in. So I think for me, it's yeah, this is where there is a real problem in the industry is creative people not being creative anymore and being lazy, basically.
Tyler, what's your experience with showing ref and mood boards to clients and them absolutely falling in love with something that they can't have?
It's an interesting question for me because sometimes I look at the mood boards and it kind of looks more like my cutting room floor versus whatever I actually send out. So I feel like it is a North Star and it's the thing that I would love to get sold in. But I do, maybe this sounds a bit pessimistic, but there is a little bit of like watering down of the most initial concepts in my career for the last few years. But yeah, if it goes on your mood board, you have to love it and find a way that it's relevant instead of just like, it would be amazing to just do the work and be like, we didn't have to do a mood board, like here's the thing. But I suppose it's a thing about reference points as well, which I always bring up. Like when we've done mood boards in the past, for me it's more to be like, when we're using the word cool, what do we mean by that? And then you go through and they point out the cool thing and you're like, okay, sweet, now I know what you think is cool. We can agree on that, and then let's proceed with that. So for me, there's a tiny bit of like style and a bit often to do with language and how we describe things, so that we are agreeing on certain words meaning certain things, and then I can take that and run with it and make it relevant to the brand or the concept that we're rolling with.
Do you think you could present to a client with no reference whatsoever, like Malika's kind of old school, get out one of the boards, on an easel with some sketches?
No, but I think you can still. I think even back then they were showing mood boards, but I think the mood board was never one person's work. The mood board was like 15 people's work. So it was a mood board.
It's a good challenge. I would love to try the idea of like just having the big cell, the thing that like sounds so good. But I also feel like now with technology where they're like, we're going to float something down the Thames for an activation. It's like, I suppose we have to just mock up that thing floating down the Thames. And then people are like, who's done that in the past? And then the mood board is like 15 different activations that have floated something down the Thames. So it's, I feel like there's the references coming in as well as what's the original idea that's happening for that brand in that moment. And then just, might as well mock it up. Here's the references as well.
I've got a really good story, another anonymous story, lots of anonymous stories in this episode, which is just so perfect for what we're talking about here. I used to work as a producer at a big, and they put in brackets, and extremely chaotic advertising agency, and we worked on an out-of-home campaign for a client where we'd been using a reference essentially as a placeholder in key visuals we presented to get the concept approved. The problem was that the client loved the reference so much that every time we tried to move the concept away from that reference, they would ask us to go back to it. I don't think we had made it clear to the client that we were literally using an existing image from a photographer and photoshopping it into the product. I think they thought we'd come up with this idea ourselves and comped it together, and the business director didn't want to tell the client that the idea they'd bought was essentially stolen. We reached out to the photographer to see if we could work with them on the project, but the client refused because they were a more expensive option. We spent the pre-production period trying to convince the client to add additional elements to the composition to push it away from the reference, and simultaneously trying to prove to our legal advisors that there were plenty of refs that looked the same and we weren't blatantly just recreating one particular ref, even though we were. It was a huge mess and incredibly stressful. I think the whole thing could have been avoided by A, not relying on one reference to sell an entire ad concept, or B, if we really needed to rely on that ref, being really clear with the client where it came from. So budget and timeline restrictions are a huge part of the problem in our processes. I think when you've got a really short timeline, it's very difficult to spend the time to mock things up. So reference is a really quick, easy way to move quickly through the project. And I have a slightly personal issue with allowing time in a project to do due diligence. So have you seen that over your career, Tyler, like timelines starting to get squished and just having less time to kind of do the work to be original?
The due diligence thing is such a big part that I've realized as well. When you present to 10 people and you're like, here's what we're thinking, here's what we're going to do, and then there's just one other person that comes in the conversation 3 weeks later and they're like, oh, isn't that like X brand from 7 years ago? And you're like, oh yeah, maybe I hadn't seen that. And so I suppose there's a tiny bit of blind hope sometimes of when you love an idea that it hasn't been done, and sometimes there is a coincidence of like, oh, that has been done 6 years ago in a different category, but it feels too close. But then also, the timelines and the budget and all of those other factors where you start to be like, okay, what is possible, that we feel like we can own. And then again, it gets out into the world, and you definitely see it on things like Brand New, where people are posting other references from other countries being like, oh, it's the exact same here in Singapore. And you're like, I wasn't aware of that market. So that I think that just when you said due diligence, I think it's such a hard thing now as well, of being fully connected, having so much to scroll of like one person probably has done a version of this, which is, I wonder if we create an AI scraper that can avoid that.
No, and sometimes I think sometimes it's a coincidence, and coincidences are fair. You know, they are fair and square. It's like, it happened to me as well, that someone said like, oh my God, this piece of work really looks like some kind of obscure pop album from the 80s from someone I had never heard of, and it really did look like it. Different style, but it was the same composition. I was like, wow. It's like sometimes you're like, something is in the almost like the collective subconscious or something. But there is something about that story, Katie, that I find, in a way, it's like it really resonates with me when you read that story, because I'm like, I could have been speaking to that person in the past, you know? And I just wanted to say that, for example, in that case with the photograph that they had sold to the client, because they had used that one reference, if the idea you think you have is already a photo that already exists, it means it's not a very good idea. Like, that should not, you know, it's impossible that you think of a concept and the photographer has done it exactly the composition, exactly the style, exactly. It means there was no idea. So this is a bad way to start. It's like...
Yeah, it's a good point.
It does feel like often with pictures, I'm thinking about like, you have to bring out a big name and be like, we're going to work with this person and do this thing. And then you're just trying to win the pitch. You're just trying to like do the work that looks good, win the pitch. And then you get through and they're like, yeah, definitely can't do that. You're like, oh, all right, let's do a version of it. I would never say so I can say anything to win the pitch.
Do a version of it. Exactly. And also I'm saying that because it happens to me as well, that I get asked a lot to rip myself off. That's the saddest of all things. It's when actually a client or an agency are convinced someone with the drawing that I already did for another client and tell me, we basically want this, but can you please change the hats a little bit and then put the boat in the background, and I'm like, what am I going to look like if I put that out there? It's this is, you're stealing someone else's idea. It's like, I did this for these clients. And so for me, I always systematically refuse it. I did sometimes rip myself off because it was too far down the line and I couldn't fight it anymore. But if I knew from the start that that's what they wanted, I always say no, just to say, like, I have to respect the original person who actually had the balls and took the risk to let me do my thing. So I don't know.
This is awesome. I'm going to move us on a little bit to talk about a little bit of the practical nature of being ripped off and what you can do about it. So in our poll, we asked people if you'd seen that you'd had work copied, what would you do about it? So 60% of people would send a polite message. Perhaps they were British audience there. 30% would ask them to take it down. 7% would ignore it, and a brave 3% would find a lawyer. So we obviously know which camp Malika's in, but there are lots of different approaches. And I wanted to share a really, really interesting story from a listener. So this is from Louise, and I'm just going to play you a voice note.
Hello, my name's Louise Lockhart and I'm an illustrator. I also make products to sell for my online shop called The Printed Peanut. I think my style is quite distinctive. I've been developing it for over 10 years now. I use a lot of risograph printing in my work, which gives a kind of neon colour palette and lots of textures. And I use my own handwriting on top of each design. A couple of years ago, around Easter, I was getting loads of messages in my inbox on Instagram saying, "Oh wow, did you design this year's Easter range for M&S?" And I kept getting loads of these messages, and I was thinking, I'm going to have to check out what this M&S range looks like. So when I saw the Easter eggs that had been designed on the M&S shelves, I did like them, but I was kind of like, oh my God, they are really close to my designs, especially my soap packaging that I've made, which I'd use a lot of sort of graphic shapes and my own handwriting in black pen, neon colours, lots of texture. So I thought, well, I better get in touch with M&S and just see what's what. And I sent an email, quite a nice email, saying lots of people have said that your new M&S Easter range looks a lot like my work. I'd like to know where you got your inspiration from, and if it's from me, then I wish you'd just asked me to do it for you rather than ripping me off. So I was quite surprised the next year. I hadn't heard anything back, but I did get an email from them saying, would you like to design this year's Easter range? And I thought, oh, well, that's an example of when you're quite nice about something, it actually pays off. I'd just like to add as well that I've not actually spoken with anyone at M&S about this situation. The people that I have worked with have been absolutely amazing. There's such a nice group of people to work with. I think it's probably a situation where they've got a team of designers, they've got mood boards up, somebody had put my soap packaging up on a mood board and they'd sort of run with it, really. Or maybe, I don't know, they got scared that I could kind of blow this sort of thing up on Instagram.
We love that voice note so much. Thank you, Louise. Such a nice story, super positive. Speaking of British, so British never to mention it again. But, you know, obviously, and she's just brought out this year's Easter range with M&S too. So 2 years in a row. So like I said, lots of different approaches. I want to talk a little bit about your approach, Malika. If you're open to talking about the cost, how often you win versus how often you don't, how you decide which ones to go after and which ones you don't, just for the people listening that have been on the precipice and don't know how to go about it.
Yes, so in a way, for me, like I always do the same thing. So the first thing is really identifying if it's a copy or not. Because I think sometimes we also, you know, we're illustrators, we have also a big ego, and, you know, there is a fine line between inspiration and copy. So for me, the rule is very simple. I try to simplify everything in my life. The rule is very simple. If I look at something and I know exactly which illustration they use or they saw, even if it's sometimes a mix of 2 or 3, but I look at a drawing and I'm like, ooh, this is this piece with this piece with this piece. If I can identify it straight away, so it's not a stylistic thing. It's more than style. It's composition, idea, story, like usually it's quite blatant. Then I'm like, this is a winnable case. The second thing is who rips me off. If it's a student, if it's a young illustrator, if it's, you know, something that is not for sale or, you know, whatever, I send a gentle email. Before I used to send very aggressive emails to illustrators. I'm very sorry, I really did traumatize a few and I apologize to them later on. Now I'm trying to be really nice. But I was a bit angry 10 years ago. Now I just say it like, I'm sending this to you as a courtesy and I'm sending it to you to help you in your career because you will never get anywhere doing this because I'm already there. So it's kind of like, this is for you, please move on. It's fine, but please move on. If this is a brand or an agency or whatever, this is a very structured way of doing it. I find the agency, I don't contact the client because the client is my leverage. So I never contact the client first. The agency is responsible for it. I write a very passive aggressive shit sandwich email, which I learned in the UK, best technique ever. Basically leaving no doubt that I know they ripped me off, and basically saying this and giving them a deadline. I need a response within 24 hours, or I'm going to the client, or I'm going on social, or I'm sending this to the lawyers, and clearly saying this is a courtesy email. I have better things to do with my life than sending this email, so there will only be one email, and usually they respond, and then this is a negotiation part. So usually they say, "Can we have a call?" Very important. They always want to have a call because I think they want to hear your voice to understand where you stand and if you're going to cave in. So that call is extremely important. Never say no to a call, and be really strong for like 20 minutes and, have this tone of like, I'm not backing down. Like, this is, now you've acknowledged, now we need to find a way to resolve this. And this is when I get my lawyer involved. So I say like, that's great, you've apologized, now this happened. Now I'm going to put you in touch with my lawyer and you're going to talk about this between yourselves. So this is when the lawyer comes in and my energy, like I have to go out and be very patient because some cases took a year or a year and a half. It's like, it could be when it's really big, it could really take a long time. But so that was the thing. In terms of cost, it's about finding the right lawyer. So as I said, the first time I did it, that guy charged me a beautiful round £1,000 for what was like probably half an hour of his time, which was a massive rip-off. Lawyers are expensive, they are, but I would say you can probably find, at least I haven't done it for a long time because now I work mainly with the one in France, but you could find someone to do that letter if you do all the research. So the more, that's very important, the more information you give your lawyer, the less they will cost you because it's about their time of work. So if you do a big PDF saying who you are, where you started, putting your references together, putting the work that's being ripped off next to the client, having all the information, like this campaign was from this year for this client, this, and then doing screenshots of where it appears. All this work is work that the lawyer should not charge you because its time is not spending on it. So I would say like probably about like £300-400 should be a normal price for a letter. And yes, it is an investment, but then you need to think about the first time you get it back, just keep that money aside. And at the end of the day, it won't look like that much, especially if it's a big brand or a big client. It's 2024. They don't want the public opinion on this. Social media is extremely powerful. Communities, creative communities are extremely powerful. And especially if it's an agency, like they will not want their client to be shamed publicly because they might lose a retainer. They might be on a retainer. That project might be nothing for them, but they might have 50 more coming that year. So I think for me that it's like, do all the due diligence, do all the work, try to delegate as much as you can and do the work as much as you can. Don't call your lawyer 50 times a day because that will cost you. Like basically, like also appreciate their time and their expertise and and be patient, and then try to keep your creative energy for yourself. But the most important thing is finding a good lawyer, and I think that's extremely difficult. It's like finding a honest estate agent. So hard. No, really, they're the worst kind of people. But they exist. They really do exist. And I think in the UK there is the Association of Illustrators. I think they must have some contacts and some. But yeah, a lawyer that specializes in intellectual property is, I think, it's a very important investment. And knowing not to pick your battles, not to go after things that are going to cost you energy. And not to go try and fight something I'm sorry, but like in China or in India, it's not gonna happen. You're not gonna win. Like, it's horrible and it's unfair, but if it's in Europe, it's better. If it's in your own country, even better.
Can I ask a cheeky question? Is it financially worthwhile? Like, what's the end result for you? I know you said you really wanted the work to come down, but I assume that you get payouts as well.
Yeah, so you can get both. I think it depends on the brand. It depends on the brand. It depends on on what you want. It also, at the end of the day, it depends on your own prices. It depends how much you value your work. So for me, it's like if I put the value of my work high, then I'm going to ask. I'm basically asking to be paid for a campaign I haven't done,
Yeah, right.
and also for the campaign never to appear again. So it's like it's a free payday, and yeah, it can be really high. I'm telling you.
So like that's good. So like as a rough guide, you might kind of, for people who are just starting and wanting to go to war with someone, go to war's dramatic, sorry, wanting to take a battle, that maybe looking at what you'd have costed the project as a good guide for what you might be asking for.
Exactly. So for example, there is no point spending a year and a half for a book cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the only thing you're going to get out of that is for the cover to disappear. You don't get the settlement every time. I didn't get a settlement every time. Like sometimes, for me, it's also a matter of priority. The priority is for the work to come down. And I've taken books off the shelf. And to me, that's amazing. Like literally, like, no, I think the best one, and like my favorite story are these guys, I can't remember where they were from, but it was like a vitamin packaging in pharmacy or something like that. And it was a blatant recall. And they admitted it. They like openly admitted it. Can't remember if they paid for it. I think they did pay for it, but they could not agree to taking the product off the shelf because there were so many of them. Or it was going to cost them like redoing all the packaging. It was just like insane. But me on my end, I was like, I cannot let it be. It's just out there. So this is not going to happen. And it was a big fight. And then the guy from the agency said like, okay, we found a solution. He said like, we basically redesigned the packaging. I mean, the side of the packaging that was your illustration. And we're creating stickers, and we're going to manually go to every single shop and stick the sticker on top of the box on all, like, it wasn't like crazy, but it was like 15,000 products or something. Would that be acceptable for you? And I was like, yeah, man, you rock. Yeah, I'm saying yes. Like,
That's hilarious.
This is so creative. I was like, then you're doing your job. There.
Yeah, I really thought that story was going to end with you in all these pharmacies buying all the stock of all these vitamins.
No, they did.
Brilliant.
And I thought that was a great way to resolve it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just wanted to shout out one more approach to this, which I thought was really lovely, and that's an illustrator called Darren Thomas McGee, who illustrates and creates merch very, very successfully, has created an Instagram account called Fake Fun Wow, because his business is called Fun Wow, and literally just posts all the rip-offs of all of his work around the world. So really light-hearted approach to it, and I guess trying not to let it bother him. So I just want to round off with, do we think it's possible to create original work in the context of this conversation that we've had? How do we create original work, and how are we going to move forward and create original work?
I'll go first. I think that for me it comes back to maybe the references that you are using, mood boards you are using. You know, if you're designing a logo, maybe don't put logos on there as other references, unless it's the idea of a logo, like, you know, how someone else integrated an arrow into a set of words, and more so just, focus on the story or the intent or the mission or anything that is just relevant only to that brand. It's, you know, your brand truth, and having that in your aesthetics is, I think, an easy way, because otherwise the bubble of looking at the best studios, seeing what's on trend, trying to follow those trends, or trying to like hit those markers for what's cool at the moment, is a pretty surefire way to look like you're copying a style, if you don't already have your own kind of house style.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what I'm going to say, Tyler, is exactly like in the same line as what you say, even if it applies more to illustration, but I think it applies to everything creative, really. It's more that, for me, originality and having a voice and and coming up with something that's yours is something that comes from inside. It's not something that comes from the outside world. So at the end of the day, it has to do with your taste, your references, what movies you liked when you were a kid, what books you like to read, what food packaging you like that's sitting on your table. I think like as a creative, you're the sum of all the things that influence you, and what comes out of your brain should be a reflection of that. And because of that, the being original is being in a way true to your inner voice, and not looking outside for inspiration, but looking inside and saying like, what do I like? What got me there? What are the things that make me tick? Because in the end of the day, the result will be the sum of millions of things. And just by being the sum of millions of things, it will be original because it's you.
Yeah. Arguably, the more complex the work is and the deeper the work is, the harder it is for someone to copy
Completely.
it. So I guess in both of your experiences, what have you learned and what would you change? Maybe Tyler, you can kick us off. What would you do differently?
I've thought about this a lot since October, and part of it is like it's hard to battle, having the perfect JPEG represent something that has taken 6 months to do, to show that it's its own thing inside of this bigger category. But I think I now just genuinely want to lead with story, like always to show the workings out. I think that peeking behind the curtain is like the most powerful thing. Like going into a Rothko exhibition and not reading about who he was and what he was trying to do. Kind of, you could look at the art and not see any value in it. So I do love the idea of kind of going forward. What's the little one pager that is the little story that makes you fall in love with it, that shows that it's true to itself? I think that's my one key takeaway.
That's great. What about you, Malika? How has your practice changed? Have you changed anything?
I think if there is one thing I do differently now and that I regret, is having been a bit too aggressive with people at the beginning. I think when it was like I did. So I think that's one thing where I wish I hadn't gone that road with, other creatives, and I'm really trying not to do it anymore. In the rest, no, I think I'm 41 now, so it's like, middle life kind of point, and in a way I get less copied, because also I'm not that, young and fresh anymore. But so it's a good thing, it's a good thing at the end of the day. But also I'm way more at peace with it, because sometimes, again, like Tyler was talking about context and looking at things in the broader context. And now when I look at the last 15 years of my work in the broader context, I really feel like this is me, like the work is me. And at the end of the day, I learned to distance myself from it a little bit and be less, get less angry, be less angry about it, because basically no one can rip off what you're going to do next. They will always rip off what you did 3 years ago. So I think it's also trying to chill and move on and keep drawing.
What a lovely, optimistic way to end the episode. This has been absolutely legendary. I feel like we've covered so much. We've covered the kind of emotional, we've covered the practical in terms of clients, we've covered how to sue the hell out of people. So I'm so grateful to you both for being incredibly candid, actually, on a topic that's very difficult to find much conversation around, which is surprising. And if you've made it to the end of the episode, please let us know what you think. Go and follow both Tyler and Malika. Obviously, don't be posting horrible things about their work on LinkedIn or adding them to your Pinterest boards. And I think that's everything. So thank you so much, both.
Thank you. This has been great.
It was a pleasure.